structure. And the other thing is like to try to find multi-professional and try to work in a multi-professional, I don't know if that's a word in English, environment. Meaning that what I was saying before, we tend to work in boxes. Okay, if I work on human rights, you have to be a lawyer. You know, a sociologist cannot work on human rights. Or, you know, a psychologist cannot work on human rights. No, I mean, I think you know, like a lot of organizations can benefit from the different careers that exist out there. I mean, there are a lot of sociologists in Latin America, a lot of psychologists in Latin America, a lot of economists in Latin America that work on human rights, and they know a lot on human rights. I think the more sharing information in terms of studies and those kind of things will help the banks not only in the lending processes, but also, you know, try to see themselves within, you know, try to change the structure of the organizations. That's it. Very good.
I just have to comment on that. Today I was looking at the diversity report that was put out by the International Monetary Fund, and one of the indexes that they use for diversity is the percentage of their professional staff who are not economists. There you go. Our next speakers are Wamara Mwine from Politics in Color. He is a print and television journalist, and Aisha Brown, who is the co-founder of Grupo Afrodescendiente. It is a collective of Afro-Latino activists committed to the education of Afro-Latino history and culture in the U.S. And they are going to manage a question and answer session after giving us some of their reaction and wrap up to the remarks. Thanks.
Okay, well, we're doing a little bit of a tag team up here. There were definitely some wonderful remarks that you all shared, particularly what resonated for me were the last few speakers that came up. I think everything can really be summed up in a quote by Mahatma Gandhi, which is, be the change you want to see in the world. And that's essentially what every single person was saying. If these institutions are truly here to create diversity and to reduce poverty reduction, they first have to implement the policies within their own organizations first, before reaching forward into the communities. One of the essential pieces of that would be recognizing its own privilege and racial discrimination and structural discrimination in those organizations, which I believe the last three speakers really hit the nail on the head when they said that. And it's wonderful to have groups that are looking at gender and diversity and disabilities, but to lump them all together, I would actually caution against that, because what we find is that, similar to affirmative action in the United States, which ended up benefiting white women more so than people of color truly do need target-specific programs. And especially as you're working with these governments, as one of the gentlemen stated, the problem in Latin America is that these governments are corrupt. They are discriminating against Afro and indigenous peoples. And when you go to Latin America, you find that even the communities themselves are physically segregating. So when it comes down to the dollars first, they don't trickle down. They kind of stop at the elite and they hold there. So while you may have a project that, you know, ends up reaching a few people that are of Afro and indigenous descent, if you do not have more projects that specifically target those communities, you're not going to see those big results. So it is critically important that we do have target-specific programs for Afro and indigenous peoples in Latin America, and then moving on to the rest of the world, making sure that lower income people are also being represented as well, because they're not represented in government. So it's critical and it's essential. Another thing that I would talk about in terms of the hiring practices, and this is my own kind of personal pet peeve, is when we talk of Latin America and we talk of Afro descendants, we only talk about them in Latin America. We're right here in the United States, we're in England, we're all through Europe, we're in Canada, and you can start recruiting from now. We are capable, We are eager to help our home countries, to serve our people in any sort of way. We still have family in those regions that are greatly affected by these policies, and we're ready to engage and we're ready to work. And beyond that, we also have the community ties and the community support. One of the things that I definitely see that's missing, and I'm grateful that ONECA was able to be here to speak on that, is that there does need to be more partnerships with the actual members of the community. Because as I stated, the governments themselves are discriminatory, that they often exclude people of color from their policies. It is critical for these organizations to caucus with members of the community, leaders of the community, that can point to and speak to their needs, their concerns, and lead these projects, co-lead these projects. And as we're working on diversity as well, they can also monitor. You have people of color who would actually rise up to monitor these organizations and say, this is where you failed, this is where you succeeded, this is where you did wrong. Because what's happening is that, just to put it frankly, we have these upper class white elite that are monitoring the actions and the responses of people of color. But we don't have the voices ourselves. Our voices are there. You know, oftentimes we talk about bringing voices to the voiceless. We're not voiceless. We're here. We just need our voices to be amplified, and we need a forum in which to discuss those voices, you know, to address our concerns and to push forward. So what I would encourage is more target-specific program, was what I'm hearing from other folks, encouraging that community participation, and then let us start thinking about ways in which we can talk about our privilege and really get in there and address what's going on internally in these organizations and how to recruit those that look more like the populations that you're serving. Out of this world, we have 1/6 of the population, about 1 billion people that are of African descent. In Latin America alone, we have between 25 to 30% of the population that are Afro-descendant. So it's important that we be the change we want to see in the world, and that is reflective in our institutions, not only demographically, but in terms of our philosophical beliefs and ideals.
Thank you. My name is Wamara Mwine, and I'm a reporter. I primarily cover the White House for Politics and Color, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia. I did a report based on what the GAP found in the World Bank, and that was basically a lot more involved than I thought and anticipated. You know, the GAP report really kind of was the tip of the iceberg for me. Going in, my attitude was, you know, what's really going on here? And immediately, as Carlos pointed out, there's a level of denial from the bank. The press office said, well, there's no discrimination at all at the World Bank. It wasn't even a possibility, which I thought was very strange, especially from all these people who were internally at the bank, who were communicating with Bea. And eventually I started to interview these people. While we were in discussions about what was happening in the bank, basically there was an incident that happened in the bank where people had spray painted some racial terms on the wall internally at the bank, which is very difficult because World Bank is a very secure place. I go to the White House every week, and security at the World Bank is even greater than the White House. I mean, a lot of people don't know that. So that means that basically somebody internally, somebody who worked there likely was the culprit in this case. You know, it was just hard to believe that Bea would contact me and say, well, there's been this incident. And I said, really? You know, we were just beginning to start this interview process, and there was something happening right in the middle of the story. So sort of like breaking news. Yeah, that's what's so there's more to this. You know, as all these speakers have said, I think you know, a big part of this discrimination situation is the disempowerment of people. And you know, I was at this security briefing at the White House the other day, and you know, it just came back to my memory about this Nigerian guy who came to the U.S. Embassy and said, you know, my son is a threat. You know, and the embassy people likely, I mean, you can't say exactly, but they likely saw this guy and said, well, that's very nice that you provide us this information, but you know, we're not going to put this guy on a list. So in doing that, they failed, they failed the whole country. And right now with this kind of threat, we can't afford to discriminate and say, oh, Aisha looks one way or whatever. We're not going to believe the information she's providing us, even if it's valuable and it's true. So there's a credibility issue that has been raised, a question mark that really shouldn't be there. And this week we saw it with Harry Reid. He made this comment about Barack Obama. I'm sure for the Obama family this was a knife in the back. I mean, they really didn't expect to hear this from someone like Harry Reid, somebody they were supposed to trust. So you look at something like that and you think, why is this language still out here? Why are we talking about Negro dialects, things like that? And it's disconcerting. But the bigger question is, and for someone like Tina, is how much longer is this going to continue? I mean, what stipulations, what processes, as he was pointing out, are we putting into place where we can prevent this? And I could go on and on, but let me just get quickly to the points that I wanted to state here in terms of what I think are possible solutions. The bank needs to identify minorities within the system that are suffering under this discrimination and get their feedback directly, because they represent a source of credible information, stories, whether they be factual, anecdotal, whatever. Their opinions count. People at the bank, IDB, needs to start talking to those folks. There needs to be a best practices sort of platform which says, okay, we're going to hire someone like Aisha tomorrow. We're going to follow her for the next 5 years and try and see, has she been treated fairly? Has she been promoted in the same way that her white counterparts have been? Do we get a sense from her that she's happy? Does she feel like she can accomplish things under the management here at this bank? And if not, well, what do we need to change to make that happen? Point number 3 is there has to be a definitive system that punishes, that has results for people that do these spring payment instances. I mean, there has to be, in this case, you can't say specifically who, we can't say for sure who is involved. But I would say in that department to just have like a standard suspension, have like a period of probation, a mandatory probation, so that those people in that department for the next 2 months know that they're being watched. It creates a situation where, hey, this is not going to just happen again. And if we find or we hear anything of somebody else speaking about this incident, that person is going to be suspended or fired. There just has to be a zero tolerance for this kind of behavior. The other thing, and Tina had mentioned this, is, you've got an opportunity here to self-identify. Not everybody is going to come out and say, I'm such and such a race, but there has to be a mandatory form. So even if people say, we're not going to identify ourselves, there has to be a mandatory form that's pushed through so that there are hard numbers, so that someone like Tina can say, okay, we've got 99% reporting on this right now. We have X amount of African Americans, we have X amount of Asian Americans, et cetera, et cetera. So then, working from that, then you have something substantive. I mean, I think Bea did a pretty good job, Gap did a good job of trying to find out this magic number. How many African Americans are actually here. But it shouldn't be such a great mystery. This is something that can be easily figured out, reported, and that organizations like Gap can also help hold Tina in a friendly way accountable for what she's doing. I think those things will help the system dramatically. And I can't stress enough the level of fear and concern that a lot of people I spoke with expressed to me as a reporter. We had initially thought it would take 3 days to do this interview and write a story. It ended up taking 2 weeks. There were so many people coming forward, so many stories. I just couldn't possibly speak with everybody. And that clearly shows that these people need to be represented by somebody. They're not being represented by the bank. And there is a level of intimidation here, and I think that we can work to eliminate that. And I hope Tinde does well. I hope that your coworker also, I hope, wish you luck in trying to address those kinds of issues. But again, going back to what I said before, best practices, having a certain high level of engagement on these issues will create sort of the best results. Oh yeah. Yeah, but I have already. Okay. I can use this. Testing.
We're going to open up the floor for questions, but just really quickly, I'm going to ask this one question by a person who preferred to be anonymous. The headline of the event refers to racial issues at the World Bank and IDB. There are also prevalent issues at the IMF. Why is the IMF excluded?
It's a good question, and we got it this afternoon by email.
Bea, can you stand up?
Sure. The IMF, actually we considered doing a report on the IMF. We are limited in terms of staff and time. However, we did get whistleblowers coming to us from the IMF in the same way they came to us from the IDB after the World Bank report came out. And we looked at the diversity report, as I just mentioned, that the IMF publishes, and the report for 2008 referred to, for 2007, referred to a report on diversity, ethnicity, and the racial profile of the staff at the IMF, which was a survey was to be done in 2000, by the end of 2008 and published in 2009. So we thought we could wait, and when that survey came out, we could then proceed. We'd have better numbers to work with. However, the report was published in August of 2009, and there was no survey. So we're essentially in the same position we were with the other IFIs, and I think we will probably begin to do a report on the IMF when circumstances will.
I have this gentleman here, and her hand raised.
Hi, I work at the IDB. My name is Bea. I'd just like to make maybe a comment. I think that in theory, of course I agree with everything that's been said in theory. I think one of the problems, that comes out of a lot of this is that many of the recommendations that are made without a knowledge of the bank procedures and incentive structures that are in place. So that when we're talking about how to make changes, for example, in the demands that the IDB makes of its recipient countries, in theory it sounds good to force countries to think about race. Or in theory it sounds good to force countries to think about black people. They could care less. But that falls outside of what right now is the IDB's mandate. So maybe the suggestion is to rethink the mandate. However, it comes out that the suggestion is how we need to be doing enforcement. And so I think the way that the bank receives that is that, well, that can't be done. Because the recommendations are not made with an eye toward how the bank works, what incentives the people who work within the bank have to address these issues, etc. So that's my recommendation. It might not be for you to do, but in general, finding out how do these banks work? What incentives do people have to come up with projects that deal with any of these, with indigenous peoples, with Afro-descendants, with gender issues, and then address those rather than the generalized criticism, which, again, I agree with.
I'm going to actually say something just 1 second. I think one of the incentives is that you'll have a great return on your investment if you invest in these communities. I mean, part of it is your bank, and your job is to loan to people that will pay back. these monies, and you're actually widening your pool if you reach out to it.
Right, but investments or incentives are more day-to-day, and so they have to do with whether or not your manager cares that you do that. And so that's what I'm doing.
I understand. I think it's just still something to think about. I know there was a woman there. Let's get back to you. I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Good evening, everyone. I'm probably one of the only two people here who's not currently part of the international community or works in a bank or what have you. However, I am a behavioral scientist, a psychologist, and I've been studying race and ethnic issues for years. And all I just want to say is that whatever organization you're from, UNESCO is it? UNESCO, all these different organizations. My whole thing is, and I'm just saying all this extemporaneously, but this hat in hand kind of attitude to ask for certain things is beyond the pale for me. And when I see on a global level this discrimination that happens in every major institution, like the World Bank and the IMF, it boggles my mind. And when you talk about diversity, and you take just a general layperson such as myself, and you say that you're the head of diversity or whatever, I'm expecting to see basically a person of color. And I'm just saying that. You know, when you talk about these different types of programs, people who are indigenous to that region or whatever, or are indigenous to that region or have that type of orientation should be involved in the process. I don't understand why this professional top-down approach. Everybody has basically accepted the white supremacist attitude and the westernization of all these different organizations. Basically, and that's what we're dealing with. This thing is systemic. There's no rocket science here. You can have people represent you, they're supposed to be represented. You can have people from Latin America in the mix with these things. You can have dark-skinned people on Telemundo. I mean, come on. Let's just kind of get with the program here and understand it for what it is. And that's all I'm trying to say, is that we really need to recognize this, and people need to start demanding and utilizing their own resources like we have had to do in this country in terms of being a person of African descent, to get our resources and to move forward. And people in their respective countries, like in Africa and all the different countries, they have natural resources and infrastructure that they need to develop and use so they can move along the continuum and decrease the dependence on these external organizations and institutions for their
Okay, we're going to go to Wamara for his question.
And we'll allow Tina to comment a little bit about maybe what she's thinking in terms of the immediate future response to that. Just a minute.
Thank you very much for all the great analysis in all the presentations. There are several people here I'd like to hire right away, so you can make a little line out there with cards and CVs. Anyway, jokes aside, I'd like to just give one piece of good news first, which is that I've invited the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism to come to Washington D.C. in June, the 16th to the 18th. He might actually be able to come. So if we can do something together while he will be here, that is one effort to build a bridge between the human rights issues and the human resources issues that I am working on. I also want to talk about incentives, and an incentive which is very sharply made. There was a comment at our diversity conference by a diversity chief from Deloitte & Touche. We invited some people from the private sector, and he works in the New York office. And he said in our webinar, which is actually available on our website, so if you can please check the website, the link is given in the, we can maybe hand out the stuff now so you can get the link. And he said that in order to convince top leaders and colleagues to work for diversity, you should give an economic, financial incentive, and then their hearts and minds will follow. So that is one thing that we have actually adopted at the conference, that we will evaluate managers on to what degree do they follow up and promote the diversity policies that and points that we have adopted, because we do have a lot of good points already, and we do have the resolutions from the conference. So this is something that we will actually do to reward people. Also, in terms of qualifications, of course, I am also mortified as a devoted diversity advisor. I am mortified each time somebody tries to make a link between diversity and poor quality, because it is, as you know, the opposite. We do get better decisions when we have a diverse team. So this is brought up by some people in our organization, but it also needs to be much clearer. And I have never met a person from an underrepresented group who would be expected to be hired or promoted having less qualifications than the next person. Actually, some underrepresented groups, like for instance women, they end up taking multiple degrees and course after course after course, and sometimes I try to stop people from all this education because I said maybe it's networking that you have to do. This link between lack of quality is of course not something we have to worry about. You mentioned we have 1 billion inhabitants in the region, and IDB has a turnover of about 150 people per year, and nobody can convince me that we cannot find people of excellent qualifications to fill up a fair quota of affirmative action, which I fully support, to fill up that quota with people who can then help and change the organization. I also want to mention to one of the brilliant speakers who said that hiring more black people, as an example, will not change the structures of, for instance, IDB. Well, I'm not so sure. I think you're underestimating the people, because we don't know yet that, first of all. We really don't know. And I know, as you said, the link between the diaspora and the people back home is very, very strong. So I actually think that we have to give organizations a fair chance, that they will change if we hire people who have linkages to those populations that the IDB, for instance, is there to support. So I am very positive about change. There's also, you all know the Sonia Sotomayor debate much better than I do. I wasn't here at the time, but I was actually reading about it. And it is a very confused debate sometimes about whether she represented herself or Latinas or women. You know, I think we all represent a number of backgrounds. Definitely people, no matter where they're from, they have a right to be recruited and promoted based on their qualifications and not on any of these matters. But then there's the added value. And there is an added value of coming from a specific group. It does impact how you work. I mean, I represent myself and my convictions and faults, and that is taken for granted. And I think we all represent one group, and we really have to focus in IDB of having more representation of the people who have those links and who have that understanding. You may have even an indigenous language. So I'm really, really very much in favor of affirmative action. And I'm trying to fight for that. I'm sorry, I'm going on. I'm fighting for affirmative action in our recruitment and promotion policy. This is something that needs a certain level of understanding, so we're working with a lot of people to try to get affirmative action, which means that a person would be hired or promoted being equally or comparably qualified with another person. And that is not so hard. I come from Norway. We have had quotas for decades, and we haven't given them up. They're not illegal in Norway. In Norway, we need quotas for men so that they can become nurses. And so, I mean, quotas can really be used. So you can rest assured that I will fight and work for this. And you also mentioned the warm welcome that we got here. And even though it's, of course, not my fault personally for what IDB has done or what the World Bank is doing, I think we all have a strong individual responsibility in being ethical in our daily work. So that cannot be stressed enough. Thank you very much.
Can I respond?
Yeah, briefly. We're going to try and get some more questions. Okay.
I just have a question for my comrades who work at the bank. Theoretically, if the bank right now, all the employees of both the IDB and the World Bank were to become Afro-descendant, just magic wand, 100% Afro-descendant or indigenous population, would the lending policies be different?
We could change them. We could change them.
The lending policies would be different if the faces of the people in the offices changed.
No, if they change the policy.
No, I'm not asking you, Dylan. I'm asking.
You mean the targeting or the actual policy?
The actual policy, the actual targeting and policy. My question is Is it structural or is it personnel?
It's both.
Let me see if we can get a brief response here.
Structures can do anything.
That's a great question. Brief answer. And this is my personal opinion, right? I think it's both structural and personality, but it also has to do with the way the institutions work, that our programs and projects are set in dialogue with the governments of the region. So, yes, having more African descendants in the bank is going to, I think, naturally increase attention to these issues. And Tinde is, I think, arguing implicitly for that by saying we need to do a better job of recruiting African descendants. But the bank has a series of formal policies which also need to be examined for their relevance to social inclusion. And governments need to be in the mix. So it's not just as simple as changing the color of the people who work in the bank.